Delighted to welcome Professor Clarence-Smith, and I'm quite curious to hear his talk about mules and men. But I'm also very pleased to restart with the new year, the Europe and the World initiatives. With this talk, we will have another one, as you know, by Professor Richard Evans next week, and then we are organizing a program of activities for the remaining of the year. So Europe and the World 2013 is starting. I will hand over to Professor Bartolomé Youn, who, as you know, is not only the instigator of the Europe and the World Forum, but is also, in this case, the presenter of this talk, Professor Clarence. Bartolomé, thank you.
Thank you very much, Federico. I will be very brief, of course. Thank you, all of you, for coming to this new edition of the forum. As you know, the Europe and the World Forum is an idea to promote precisely the study of Europe within a wider context. And last year we had different seminars, workshops, and roundtables. And this year we are starting with Professor William Clarence-Smith. It's a way to enhance not only the visibility of Europe, but also to enhance the visibility of Europe and its connections with the rest of the world in our department. I think that some of you already know Professor Clarence-Smith. He is Professor of Economic History at the SOAS, or the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He has been head of his department for some years, I don't know how many, but he has been very much involved in administration, which was not an impediment to keep working and to keep publishing and books. Professor Clarence-Smith is a specialist on Islam, Africa. He has written on many different subjects. Particularly, the last two monographs are one on Islam and the abolition of slavery, and another one on cocoa and chocolate from 1765 to 1914. And I would say that he is a man who has a sort of encyclopedic specialization, if that is not a contradictio in terminis, which is a contradictio in terminis. But he has written on many different subjects like diseases, consumption of coffee, cocoa, chocolate, etc., textile, cotton, particularly diasporas, scientific and technological exchanges, migrations, diasporas, entrepreneurs, etc. So it's difficult to find a subject in which Professor Clarence-Smith didn't contribute in a very interesting way, but also he has written on many different areas of the world, on Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa. I know that he has a deep knowledge also of some particular aspects of Latin American history. So that's why I could say that he is a truly global historian, which is something that today is not so common. Everybody says that he or she is a global historian, but at the end, there are not so many. There are very, very few at the end. And this is maybe because why he is one of the three editors of the Journal of Global History, which is a big success, a big editorial success. And in that sense, I also encourage you, all of you who have some interest in global history, to talk to him about theoretical aspects or even about strategic aspects to publish, for example, in this very well-known, very important journal at this point. I want to thank you, William, very warmly, your presence here also, because I know that you were very much busy during this time of the year, and it is a real privilege that you could find a moment, a very short moment, because you are leaving this afternoon, and you arrived yesterday with many problems from Munich. But I want to thank you, the effort that you made to be here today with us. and the floor is yours. I asked if the room is busy at 1. It seems that the room is free, so if we need, we can prolong the discussion beyond 1 o'clock, though I know that maybe some of you will have some things to do, but in any case, we have that possibility. You could speak for 40, 45 minutes, you said? And then we will pass to the debate of your ideas on questions, etc. And you have the floor. Thank you.
Very much. Well, it's great to be here again. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm afraid I forgot to bring any flyers for the Journal of Global History. But nowadays you don't really need flyers. You can look it up on the Cambridge University Press website. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is mules, perhaps not a very common subject. This links in then to what's been called the animal turn in history. Now, I know there are lots and lots of turns. We have spatial turns, we have this turn, the other, but one of them is the animal turn. Like many of these fashions in history, it's driven in part by things outside history. It's driven by the growth of animal liberation, by a new attitude towards animals. And there's a kind of interplay all the time between the historical side and the academic side to this, but also the emotional drive. And this is something that you'll find very much present. This is Harriet Ritva, who's one of the founding members of the animal history. But this sort of tension between the campaigning drive and the history is very clear in the H list, H animal. So if any of you want to find out more about animal history and the animal turn, it has all sorts of extraordinary debates. When I started participating in it, it was going on about the historical incidence of homosexuality in sheep, which was fascinating debates, but perhaps somewhat outside most people's interest. But it has this cutting edge of radicalism. Richard Bullitt, in many ways, the high priest of kind of much of animal history today. But mules have met with less interest even than cod. If cod was a fish that changed the world, I think in many ways one could argue that mules changed the world even more and contributed very much to the creation of modernity. This is Richard Bullitt, who writes all sorts of interesting books. He writes lots of fiction, and in fact his last work of fiction is about a donkey. It's a satirical work, which is quite amusing. Whether it tells you much about the history of donkeys, I'm not so sure. What are mules then? They are the product of mating a male donkey or a jack with a female horse or a mare, and there's a whole kind of complicated vocabulary in all sorts of different languages. This is a very large modern mule out of a Percheron mare. You can see that this is a very substantial animal. People tend to think of mules as kind of small animals, but you can breed anything. You can breed an 18-hand mule, you can breed an 8-hand mule. These are, in a sense, designer animals. There are also hinnies, which people talk about much less, which are the opposite cross from a male horse and a female donkey. But in the literature, these are often called mules. For instance, about half of all the Cypriot mules, which were exported to British India, were actually hinnies. And Cyprus is a great center of hinny production. It tends to be concentrated in the Mediterranean. There's almost no hinny production in the Americas. This is a young hinny. Looks a bit more horse-like than a mule. Tends to be smaller, but is often a better riding animal than a mule, although that, again. Now, the disadvantages, and I start with disadvantages, are that both of these animals or crosses are sterile. They come in male and female, and they are quite sexually active. Particularly the males are quite sexually active and therefore often castrated. The breeding is not all that easy. It has been called animal rape by the more campaigning animal types. The fertility is lower, miscarriage rate is higher, so there are problems with breeding. This is a very large American mammoth jack breeding with a small Palestinian mare. Now you notice that the mare is tied, is hobbled, so as to stop her kicking the jack. But there the size is more or less the same. Whereas in a lot of mule breeding, the jack is quite a lot smaller than the mare, and the mare has to be put into a pit, or the jack has to be raised on a special kind of dais, and it's often quite difficult to get the conception occurring. Another disadvantage is that mules are most effectively bred in plains, in relatively temperate areas, but they're mostly used in mountains, so that you have to have an enormously complicated trade over thousands of miles in some cases. Also, and perhaps less obvious, you have to keep up breeding populations of donkeys, of horses, which are sometimes not much used for anything else except breeding mules. So there's a kind of long-term commitment, if you're going to do this seriously, and a whole series of animals which are hard to do anything with. Sometimes you simply have to eat them. We've had a lot of problems with horse meat in England recently. This may be one of the sources. This is a Mulassier stallion in Poitou in France, a rather large, ugly horse, not of much use to anything else. Now remember, it's the Mulassières, it's the mares that you need to make the mules. The males, you get roughly 50% of males, what the hell do you do with them except eat them? Of course, the French are very good at eating horse meat, so not so much of a problem. There are also, and these are even less well known, some socio-religious disadvantages. To mate animals of different species is contra naturam, as the Romans would have said. And on the whole, for Hindus, Jains, and to some extent for Buddhists, although to what extent for Buddhists, I'm still trying to find out, it is a very horrible thing to do, to ally a noble horse with a very base donkey. Remember that in India, donkeys are the only animal that the complete outcasts, the Dalits, the pariahs, can have. It's the only animal that they can own, and therefore the donkey is completely impure because of its association with these completely impure people. It's an animal which is used to pick up rubbish and all sorts of other disgusting things, whereas the horse is at the very top of the animal spectrum. So to mate the two is appalling. Note that for Hindus and Jains, even to own a mule is polluting, right? So this is the area of the world which is most anti-mule. Now, for the Abrahamic tradition, for Jews in Leviticus 19:19, thou shalt not gender with a diverse kind. So it's not allowed for Jews to make mules. However, with that wonderful casuistic thing about Judaism, it's fine to actually use them. And Islam has inherited this, although in Islam the prohibition is much less clear. The ahadith which forbid mule breeding are weak and not necessarily recognized by some of the ulama. But it is quite often said that you may not create a mule, but you may use one. So in the Abrahamic tradition, there's a kind of, well, not a confusion, but there's a division between the mating and the use. This leaves then Confucians and most Christians for whom it is generally speaking okay, but with some reservations. We'll come back to the reservations later on. This is one of the hadiths against mule breeding. There are a number of different hadiths, and some of them come from quite strange collections of things, quite unrelated things, which are forbidden to the faithful to do. What are the advantages then? Well, the advantages essentially are biological. This is what's called hybrid vigor. These are stronger, cleverer, more frugal, healthier animals, and much longer lived than their parents. So these are good work animals. Moreover, you don't have to worry about distributing their time between mating and working because they're sterile, so they simply work all the time. And they are design animals because they are recreated at every generation. You can make any kind of mule. You can make mules of all sizes, all conformations. This, for instance, is a saddle mule in the United States. This is a relatively slender animal. This is a fine animal. This is a pack mule in Turkey. You'll see immediately this is a smaller animal, which is of course, much more effective for packing. You have to have a smaller animal. And you can go right down to mini mules, which are used as pets, for instance, in the United States today. When do they originate? From about 2000 before the Common Era, so quite a long time after the domestication of both donkeys and horses. Donkeys coming up from the south, horses coming down from the north, and the two meet somewhere around eastern Anatolia and somebody or other has the idea of mating them together, who knows who. And once this is done, they then diffuse both westwards along the Mediterranean and eastwards along the Silk Road to China and southwards to Ethiopia. So roughly along that desert belt or the desert margins, you get the mules diffusing. Here's the Silk Road, which is a very important route for the movement of mules into East Asia. Mules are present all this time, but there is a real early modern boom, and I'm not entirely sure why, but the production of mules really increases to an extraordinary degree. They're effective in a large number of economic fields, but particularly perhaps for transport in stony and steep areas. I think partly this is a military phenomenon, so it's to do with the introduction of firearms, but it's still not entirely clear to me why from about the 16th century there seems to be an upsurge of mules around the Old World. I'll come back to the New World in a second. This is an Ottoman military mule, 1576. The Ottomans made perhaps rather less use of mules than one might have expected. They try and use camels, and in fact they use another hybrid, a hybrid between a Bactrian and a dromedary camel. They use in the Balkans quite a lot, and they're perhaps not very well adapted. It might have made more sense, in fact, for the Ottomans to have used more mules. So this is one of the areas which I'm interested in finding out more about. This is an Ethiopian party, and in fact what's interesting here is that they're riding both mules and horses. Generally speaking, though, the Ethiopians would ride mules to battle and then would change to horses. Quite a common pattern because mules are much more intelligent animals than horses, and they don't see why they should get killed, and therefore they tend to refuse to. It's not that they're not fast, it's not that they're not, and some civilizations have used mules in battle. There's perhaps the least change in the early modern period in what I've called Persianate Eurasia, which is slightly provocative because I'm assuming that there is intent of Persianate cultural domination in the central lands of the Old World. And on the whole, perhaps a chronic shortage of mules is one of the things which strikes one in this area. Now, to what extent is this due to the Islamic prohibitions, to the fact that they are not meant to breed mules in Islam, at least some people would argue that you're not meant to, is something which I'm still trying to find out more about. There is an extension into South Asia to some extent by the Mughals, but they come up against the Hindu resistance to the mule, the dislike, the hatred almost of the mule from their Hindu subjects. And it's only really the Sikhs who develop a real enthusiasm for the mule. These are some Sikh pilgrim mules today, right up in the mountains. They're used very much for this purpose today. This is, of course, actually in India. In East and Southeast Asia, I think the reason why we get an enormous development in mule breeding is because of the hostility of the Mongol steppe. Once the Mongols have been thrown out of China, there is a need to develop some kind of effective defense. And the Chinese are always much, much better at breeding mules than they are at breeding horses. Now, why that should be is another interesting question, but there is this constant problem that the Chinese have in breeding horses, whereas they breed some of the best mules in the world. Now, it may also be that the Chinese population explosion, which develops from about this period, means that there's greater economic use of mules, and certainly the movement of mules into Southeast Asia is very much the result of kind of Chinese economic pressures. This is a mule caravan in southwestern China. This is still actually very important for this whole region, is the mule caravan. You notice the steep areas. This is a very good area for mules. In early modern Europe, then, there's a renaissance in classical knowledge, which may have something to do with it. The rediscovery of Columella. Columella was the greatest, from Spain, was the greatest classical author on mules, and was only known in fragments before. So the rediscovery of his work was perhaps important, although how much theoretical literary works really matter in this kind of very practical thing is difficult to say. Southern Europe then develops very much as kind of mule societies, and particularly Iberia, the largest number of mules in Europe, in Spain. But this doesn't pass completely accepted. There is a real fear that the breeding of war horses is being affected by too many mules being bred. And in the case of Spain, they can't breed enough mules, so they're importing really quite large numbers from France, and there is always this very mercantilist dislike of a drain of bullion to France for the Spaniards to buy mules. France is quite interesting because it's a big producer of mules, but nothing like such a large user of mules. Here we have a Spanish, an African slave drummer from a Spanish thing. The drummers are always mounted on mules, I'm not quite sure why, and tended to be black slaves. Here we have a picture from Goya, a man and a woman on a mule, perhaps a rather large weight, but of course this is the whole point about mules, they're capable of bearing a great deal. Now the real thing which transforms the mule population, though, is the expansion of Europe into the New World. This is where you get the really explosive spread of mules, and the largest number of mules per head of human population is in the Americas. And this is because the Amerindian population collapses, and there's something of a causal relationship because they are brutally exploited as porters, and therefore this is one of the things that contributes to very high death rates amongst Amerindians. Llamas only effective in the in the Andes, and simply cannot fill the gap. So what we have is the mules coming to fill the lack of transport materials, perhaps 2 million mules in Latin America by the late 18th century. This is from Braudel, but Braudel, I have to say, doesn't give any real sources. This is one of these typical examples where he seems to draw these figures out of his thumb. One of the most important places where they're used is in Panama on the Camino Real, and here you have the various possibilities. In fact, by the 18th century, the green one, where a large part of it is by river, is the most common. So the mules are only being used on a relatively short. One has to say that the death rate of the mules here is absolutely phenomenal. The number of mules which die. So we have a constant problem of resupplying mules from Central America to Panama. This is the Camino Real to Las Cruces. This is the still being used in 1914, and this is the one, in fact, to the river. Note, this is a paved road, very important for Spanish imperial thing. This is a statue in Colombia to the mule. So here in Colombia, perhaps there is the greatest romanticization of the mule in Latin America, and you probably know the logo for Colombian coffee with José Valdez, which uses the mule as part of its imagery. In the New World, then, mules are used also for mining, absolutely crucial to silver extraction, especially in Mexico, although the raising of the ore is often done by horses, and I'm not sure why. The crushing and the treading to amalgamate with mercury is very much a mule thing. This is the arrastre in Mexico in the 18th century. I'm not sure if you can see this, but the mules are blindfolded. And this is quite a common phenomenon with the use of work animals. This is the patio. This is where they're amalgamating it with mercury. This is very dangerous, very high death rate because the mercury is extremely toxic. And so they get through a very large number of mules in doing this. For some reason which I don't entirely understand, Peru uses fewer mules in its, and doesn't use this system. And I'm not entirely something I need to find out more about. In Brazil, then, this is Minas Gerais in about 1825. Regendas is a very interesting artist because he does a lot of painting of mules. Now, one of the things you might note here is that we have both a horse, the white animal is a horse, but the other animal is a mule, a riding mule, and then we have the lady at the back sitting side saddle on a much more corpulent mule, which is more of a work mule. So we get this sense of the different types of animals which coexist in this system. Plantation mules of growing importance in the Caribbean, particularly for sugar, and there's been a real tendency for historians to underestimate the importance of the mule in sugar, particularly by the 18th century. And this is partly because of, in English anyway, a problem with language, that cattle in 18th century English means animals, means large animals. But modern historians have interpreted cattle as meaning oxen. It's modern English, but it's not 18th century English. And in fact, the iconographic evidence is quite important here, because you'll see pictures where it says, cattle's driving a mill, and you'll see that they're mules. So you can see how the linguistic thing has affected this. This is Suriname, where the mule bringing things down to the wharf in 1839. The Guyanas are quite interesting because the mules are used a lot for pulling punts along the waterways. So I couldn't get a picture of that, so I've only got this picture of the wharf use. This is Martinique and the French West Indies. I think this is almost certainly a mule, and here we have the three upright rollers for crushing the cane, driven by a single mule. This is a very common pattern right around the Caribbean. In terms of breeding, what we get in the Old World essentially is an intensification of breeding in older areas, and a typically sexist approach whereby it's the jack, it's the male donkey, to which all the attention is given. Male donkeys reach astronomical rates in terms of how much you can sell them for. They become extremely valuable animals. Very little attention is paid to mares. So it's all seen, the man is what matters, the woman doesn't matter, to take that analogy. In Italy, we have this example of the Martina Franca mule, where we get an improvement in the local stock with Catalan jacks, and therefore we get the largest mule in Italy down in the southeast of Italy. This is a Martina Franca jack. You can see this is a very large animal, very different from what you might think of as a small donkey. So these are special breeding mules, which are bred to a very large size. Note also the dark color, many of the best breeding mules of this type. This is a Murghese horse, Murghese. It's written sometimes with a GH, sometimes with a G. I don't quite understand that. Which is what they use. So this is a fairly large, stout horse used as in order for the breeding. And this is the result, the Martina Franca mule, which was the standard mule of the Italian army until quite recently. In the New World, then, we have extensive breeding rather than this more intensive breeding of the Old World, in which the emphasis really is on producing very large numbers of very cheap mules. And the Pampas produce the cheapest mules of all and become really the heart of the New World mule economy, but also the Llanos of New Granada, or what is today Venezuela and Colombia, and the Mexican borderlands, both south and north, to some extent the islands as well, and in Brazil it develops initially in Minas Gerais and southern Bahia. The grasslands of the world gives you some sense of where some of this breeding occurs, although not in Africa. And of course, one of the reasons in Africa is the disease pattern is different. This is, not sure how well you can see this, and these are actually horses in the Venezuelan Llanos, which is one of the big areas of mule production. And here, this is in the Pampas. This is, again, I couldn't get an actual mule here, so I've got some horses herding cattle. These are, of course, modern photos. Now, if we move to the modern period, the sort of long 19th century, if we look at what David Edgerton has written about technology, he argues that new technologies don't displace old ones necessarily, or at least they don't replace them, I should really say. They reconfigure and reorganize them. And he actually uses horses as one of his case studies, but one could use mules just as well to show that mules continue and are in many ways enhanced by the changes happening in the long 19th century. This is his book, The Shock of the Old, so it's a deliberately provocative title in which he argues that the old continues in new forms. If we look at different sectors in mining and manufacturing, steam power edges out mules particularly precociously, and indeed other work animals, so that you get mechanization relatively quickly. Probably the last major mule boom in mining is the Kimberley, the early years, the Kimberley diamond mines in South Africa. Although I've just discovered, actually, quite recently, that the Klondike Yukon gold rush, right at the very end of the 19th century, also drew in mules on a large scale. In fact, the first time that mules become important in Canada. So perhaps one should push the dates back on this. These are pioneers, the Klondike gold rush, using the mules to pull their wagons to get the very, very difficult terrain in the northwest of Canada. In terms of agriculture too, there's a steam milling replaces animals, wind and water, relatively quickly. Certainly by the middle of the 19th century, the use of animals in this kind of agricultural processing is becoming much less, although it still goes on. This is a mule trapiche in Cabo Verde, in the what used to be a Portuguese colony. A very rough and ready system, but you're using 2 mules to crush the cane under the old system. This is to produce rum, usually, not sugar. But at the same time as you're getting this decline in some uses of mules, you're also getting a tremendous boom in the 19th century, essentially in the plantation sector to carry cane. Now, of course, it's very important to get sugar cane to the mill very quickly because the sucrose content in the cane falls quite rapidly after it's been cut. And so mules are much faster than oxen, and this is probably one of the reasons why they're used a great deal. And we get them, but they're not just in sugar. It's quite important to note that mules are used on a rising scale across the 19th century all over the place. Perhaps most importantly in the United States South for the ploughing of cotton. And of course we have this very famous slogan at emancipation of the slaves, 40 acres and a mule. This is what was promised to the ex-slaves. It wasn't what was given to them, I hasten to add. The number of ex-slaves who actually got 40 acres and a mule was relatively small. But the mule remains the chief work animal with the single plow, which is rather unusual in the southern United States. Here we have an example of this from 1930. Note the relatively small plow, and in fact the relatively small mule in American terms, not in world terms, but the American cotton mule was one of the smaller ones produced, about 15 hands, whereas American mules sometimes go up to 18 hands. We also get problems with disease. So Mauritius in the Indian Ocean is a classic example where Trypanosoma evansi or Sura wipes out virtually all the equids, horses and mules and donkeys which are used, and then the government steps in, and very unusually actually for the British government's usually very laissez-faire, but the British government here steps in with a massive program of subsidized mechanization. Note, however, that the effect of this on Mauritius sugar is that Mauritius sugar never recovers. We get stagnation of production from then on, so probably this was a mistake. The British government would probably have been more well advised to have brought in more mules instead of mechanizing. There's a very interesting ideological problem here. The ideology of mechanization as being superior to animals plays a part, I think, in this decision. This is a typical example of steam traction engine. These were brought in on a large scale in Mauritius, but I don't think they're anything like as economically effective as a mule. I'd go for a mule any day rather than these juggernauts. In terms of general transport, in the 19th century, we have, of course, the new steam technology, which replaces mules on long-distance routes, but almost inevitably creates a much greater demand for mules on medium and short-range transport. So at the ports, at the railheads, and when I say ports, I mean river ports as well, we get a huge boom. And we also get a big boom in urban mule transport. So the steam displaces mules in some cases, but it also increases their use, probably overall increases it quite dramatically. This is Port of Spain in Trinidad in the 1890s, where we have both a mule-drawn tram and a mule-drawn cart. Quite important to stress this about the tram, because people often think, well, you've got a tram, you've got a train, it must be run by steam. In fact, a lot of the early rail technology is drawn by animals, not necessarily by mules, in some cases by horses, particularly in many Western towns, the trams are horse-drawn. And this persists for quite a long time in some places. Perhaps most importantly, though, in terms of a new market, is that the military market for mules in the 19th century is transformed by a technological invention, which is the screw gun. So this is the artillery piece, which is dismantled into 5 or 6 pieces and is used particularly in mountain batteries. And this is important right through to World War II. The Nazis fight a rearguard action in the Carpathians against the advancing Russian troops as late as 1944, essentially based on mule powered mountain batteries. Where they got their mules from, I think they nicked them from the Italians, but I'm not entirely sure, because all the Italian troops on the East Front were equipped with mules, but the Germans had problems in getting hold of mules. Note also another thing which increases the use of military mules is the homogenization of the baggage train. Many early modern baggage trains were an incredible mix of every animal you can imagine. And in the 19th century, what tends to happen is standardization around the mule, because it's a fast animal, it carries a lot. In India, for instance, this is Lord Roberts, who takes one look at the horrendous mess of the Indian Army's baggage train and says, everything on mules, right? So there's a use there which... So this military demand for mules then, of course, is very much linked to the incidents of warfare. As soon as there's a major campaign, the price of mules goes shooting up, the demand for mules goes shooting up, and then when the war is over, it falls back again. This is an early photo, 1863. In those days, it was best to take still photos, so we get a dead mule in the American Civil War, in which mules were used on both sides, but were a particular advantage of the South. It's often said the South didn't have many military advantages, but one of the advantages it had was much better mules. This is a gun mule, American gun mule in 1916, and it's incredibly bureaucratic about the use of every kind of equipment which has to be, this is the barrel section is being used on this particular mule. But this is a very, very important technology for small colonial wars, particularly the British wars of the northwest frontier. The way you kept the Afghans in check in those days were with mountain batteries based on mules. Reorganization of mule supply then in the 19th century, huge development of the American mule industry. The Americans hadn't really used mules in the British colonial period almost at all. They imported a few mules from Britain itself, surprisingly, but very little indeed. And it's with independence that the Americans really developed mule production. George Washington is often called the father of the American mule, which is true and is not true. There were mules there before George Washington, but it was his single-minded dedication to the use of the mule and to the importance of the mule and his breeding of mules on his own estate at Mount Vernon, which certainly did a great deal to develop the American mule. But where it really develops is in these 3 states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri. And of course, the Americans always have to do everything bigger, better than anyone else. And these really are the best mules in the world by the end of the 19th century. And they really are bigger, better than mules you can get anywhere else. But they're also more expensive. They cost more to feed, and they're not necessarily so good in mountain territories. It's the mules from the Rio de la Plata, from South America, which really take over the world market after equine disease devastates the Venezuelan llanos from the early 19th century. This is a parting gift from the Spanish forces which come to put down the Venezuelan rebellion. They bring with their horses Trypanosoma evansi, which simply destroys equines throughout Venezuela and Colombia, through in the llanos, not so much in the mountains. So the La Plata then takes over the supply to the Caribbean. This is Malvina. This is I think this is a Danish ship, actually, which is carrying mules. And you can see the mules are stacked on deck, but also down below. One of these sailing ships would carry 100 to 200 mules. They're taken to the Amazon and to the Caribbean, to the Indian Ocean. And this remains a sailing ship technology for a long time, which is terrible for the mules, because a mule suffers, an equine cannot vomit, and a mule suffers terrible distress in conditions of storms, and in fact many die. And one of the things which I'm trying to understand more about is the failure of Australia to take over the Indian Ocean market. Australia takes over the Indian Ocean market for horses in the 19th century with its whalers, but it leaves the Indian Ocean to the South Americans. Now, I don't think this is economic. I think this is essentially cultural cringe. I think this is a typical example of the Australians looking over their shoulder at the British, at the English, and adopting the English prejudice against the mule and the donkey, and saying, and you get a lot of stuff in the Australian press at this time about these monstrous creatures and how you cannot produce them. Mules are associated in England with poverty, with the Irish, with a Celtic fringe, with papacy. They're seen as Catholic animals. Everything's against them. So the English don't like to make mules. And I think the Australians simply take over this attitude. So this is, I think, a very good example for economic history of where ideology trumps economics. However, the Australians do make mules. They make very good mules. And one of the few markets where they are actually able to outcompete the South Americans is the Pacific, because that really is a long way from the Rio de la Plata. So these are Australian mules on their way to Fiji, to the Fiji sugar plantations in 1914. The real decline of the mule from the 1940s, the internal combustion engine hits the mule much more than steam, and it's really after the Second World War. But I've put here actually the global mule numbers have risen. That's not entirely true. My figures were out of date. They've actually fallen again, so we're back to about 10 million global mules today. But there are certain things which affect the mule, the oil price. For instance, Cuba is very much a mule society today because they can't afford to buy oil anymore. So for third world countries, it often makes more sense to go for the animals. This is my attempt at mapping the incidence of mules and donkeys about 1910. The American is completely wrong. It should be much more concentrated on the south. I've done it that way. But it's interesting to compare that with 2003, where mules have virtually disappeared from the Western world, right? And are now very much a third world animal, and particularly a Chinese animal. The green, this is done by a kind of color symbol, so the green shows the highest numbers of all. And China has the greatest interest, in a sense, in mule production. Here we have Che Guevara, that great icon of third world rebellion, on a mule. I'm not entirely sure why he was riding a mule, but perhaps to show that he was with the people. And finally then, the renaissance of the Western mule, which has occurred in the last couple of decades, really, partly because it's become much easier to breed them through artificial insemination and through cloning. There's a huge debate in America at the moment as to whether a cloned mule is allowed to take part in mule racing in the West. And mule racing is one of the things that they like doing in Nevada, for instance. But it's quite interesting the way in which in riding, racing, rodeo, gymkhana and things, mules have slowly, particularly in America, have invaded the horse domain. There's much less resistance to the mule in the United States than there is in Europe in ideological terms. And so a lot of events which used to be simply for horses are now for mules as well. Forestry, very important because mules are much more, equids actually more generally, are much better in terms of ecology for forests. The Amish, of course, here we have an ideological thing. They can't use tractors, they can't use machines, so they use, some use mules. Interestingly, the Amish have split. So some Amish say that mules are not haram, to use an Islamic term, and some say they're okay. And I can never remember what the theological arguments are on both sides of the Amish debate. Herding, interestingly, even in Australia, where they don't like to admit it. And then recently, military. The American military decided to get rid of mules in 1956, but having got enmeshed in Afghanistan, they found they have to have mules again, and so they have a breeding program in California in which they supply mules to their forces. This is an Amish 8-mule team, I think harrowing in America. These are big, strong American mules. I mean, these are kind of thing which, when the Greeks saw these mules arriving in martial aid after the Second World War, they couldn't believe it because they were twice the size of the Greek mules, right? But this is, Amish agriculture works. I mean, you can argue about lots of reasons why it works, but it definitely does. And this is a hinny actually being used for working cattle in America. Hinnies are often better than mules as riding animals. And here we have US irregulars in Afghanistan in 2001. Unfortunately, these are all on horses, but it's interesting that in order to supply them, they use mules. Right? All the supply trains for these irregular forces, which are much more effective than the American regular army, were mule-borne. So in conclusion then, I my argument, of course, is that the contribution of mules to the making of early modernity has been underestimated, and one has to say that when one's an author in order to sell one's books and get an audience for one's articles, and that the flexibility, I think, of the response to technological change in the 19th century is one of the things which has been perhaps most underrated. Although I have to say that against this charge, Fernand Braudel himself did actually stress the importance of mules, and it's really something that he's not been perhaps followed very much by his successors in looking at the importance of this extraordinary animal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William, for this presentation that take us in a long travel around the world and around during a long time. And I think that there are many interesting aspects to discuss. Particularly, I found very interesting the consideration of both ideological, religious, and economic, technological factors, which were influencing in different historical contexts the use of mules, and that at the end you can explain globalization in with many different tools and perspectives. And I will open the floor for questions or opinions or whatever you want. Who is opening? Maria?
Thank you for a really cool and nice presentation. I was just wondering, because you show here the importance of the mules throughout a very long time and all over the world. And I was just wondering the status of the mules and how well they were recognized among, and if that might have led to a higher status in some societies. Yeah, strong question.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm glad to know that they're cool. But when were they cool, and as defined by who? There are two problems. One is the association with the donkey, which is definitely not cool. And there is something which I can't really understand, which is the persistent negative stereotyping of the donkey. All right? Which is particularly odd in a Christian civilization. After all, the Holy Family went to Egypt on a donkey. Christ rode in triumph in Jerusalem on probably a big white riding Damascus donkey, not the kind they show in pictures. And the stripe, the cross on the donkey's back, which you don't get on all donkeys, you get on some donkeys, but it's seen as the mark of Christ. So you would expect Christian civilization to consider donkeys very highly, right? But the strange thing is, I think there's a kind of Germanic influence coming in here, the Germanic love of the horse and the worship of the horse, which kind of influences it. I don't quite know what it is, but in all civilizations, early modern and modern civilizations that I know of, the donkey has very low status and is the butt of many, many jokes. Now, to what extent can the mule escape from those varies, I think, enormously. My argument, therefore, is that on the whole in Northern Europe, the mule is condemned. It's donkeyfied. It's seen as part of the donkey culture. And it's particularly perhaps interesting in England, where mules are more common. Actually, mules do exist in England. They exist in the New Forest. They exist in Cornwall. They exist, of course, in Ireland. So we do get mules, but they are looked down upon. Right? Whereas in Southern Europe, there isn't the same. So there's a kind of real north-south split in these terms. And the same is true in Asia, that the Chinese look very positively on the mule. Chinese statistics, interestingly, count horses and mules together, which is annoying for the economic historian, but it tells you something about the way they're seen. Whereas as soon as you get to the Mongols look down on the mule as a terrible thing. So there is a kind of geography, a kind of ethnogeography to be made of why some people will look positively on the mule and others will not. But basically it's cool in some places and it's very uncool in other places.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Just a couple of short questions. First of all, in terms of the Labour history, secondly, mules as casualties in wartime, ethical perspectives on mules, are they always considered in contradistinction to horses? And are there two types of wartime casualties, measured and perceived? So, but I'm not sure if for us, just three things that came to mind.
Right. Well, first of all, in terms of plantations in particular, one of the things which I think one needs to look at is the fluctuation in slave prices. So as slave prices rise in the 18th century, I mean, mule prices also rise, but I think relatively less. And so there's a kind of trade-off. And I think one of the things that one finds is that it becomes more and more economical to use mules as the cost of using porters or other or using labor in general. So there is a kind of slave-mule trade-off. There's also a slave-mule trade-off in terms of resistance, because one of the things, it's very difficult to get at this, but one of the things which does seem to happen is that slaves maltreat livestock extremely badly. So it's the typical thing, if you're at the bottom of the social pyramid, you hit the people who are underneath you. And if there's no people underneath you, you hit the animals. And so African slaves seem to have treated livestock abominably, very cruelly, very harshly. And the mule was much more resistant. The mule was much more capable of taking mistreatment by humans than horses or donkeys. So this is the argument which comes through a lot of the... now, it's often expressed in very racist terms that these dreadful Negroes, treat animals appallingly, which is kind of ironic in a sense, given the way in which they're treated. But this is a fairly constant theme, that you will always use mules where you expect the labor force to treat the animals badly. Right? Having said that, of course, there is a problem that the prices of mules tending to rise, and therefore so there is a real trade-off. In fact, one of the things which happens, which is very interesting in the case of mercantilism, is that attempts to supply the Caribbean with European mules, particularly with Poitou mules from southwestern France, simply founder because of the cost. The Venezuelan mules are so much cheaper that they are capable of outcompeting. So all the mercantilist attempts to get, and of course Spain doesn't produce enough mules. Spain is a net importer. On a large scale, Spain is importing about 20,000 mules a year in the 18th century. So Spain can't supply its colonies. France barely can. And so I think what's happening is an undermining of the whole mercantilist structure. By 1796, mules are the single largest import of the British Caribbean. So even in the British case, where the British have all this cultural prejudice against mules, they simply, they can't resist this. And there's a lot of stuff about planters asking the British to relax mercantilist regulations to allow them to. And the free port system from 1766 in the Caribbean is quite a lot of it is aimed at increasing the supply of mules to the British Caribbean. In terms of sort of Anglo-Protestant prejudices against the mule and how they play out. I mean, I think this is something which one really needs to look at more. I mean, it's something which I'm trying to work on. Exactly what kind of sources you can get for this. I mean, there are a number of things one can say about this, and that is that there are certain categories of people who are expected to ride mules. So, for instance, even after the Reformation, lawyers, doctors, these sorts of people are expected to ride mules, professionals, right? And this is a Catholic thing, which is, I'm not sure this is ever embodied in canon law, but ecclesiastics, including the Pope, will only use mules and not horses. I think it's partly to do with the attempts to stop Germanic worship and sacrifice to the horse. But this seems to go over after the Reformation, so you continue to get this use of like quasi-ecclesiastic professionals, as well as ecclesiastics will tend to ride mules. In terms of the, what was your last question? On the whole, I find that actually the casualties are not treated separately, and they're very often, sometimes they're even lumped together. But one of the things which is quite striking is the way in which the mules tend to have lower casualty figures. So if you look at the Anglo-Boer War, for instance, where the equine casualties were absolutely phenomenal, the second one, the 1899 to 1902, mule casualties are about half of horse casualties. And this may be because they're not used much in direct combat roles, but I think, in fact, in the Anglo-Boer War, there's relatively little direct combat use of horses. So I don't think it's that. I think it's a greater resistance to disease is probably the main reason why that happens. But they're not, on the whole, treated very separately. And I've never come across a sort of sense that, oh dear, we've lost lots of horses, but we've lost mules, and that doesn't matter. And I think one of the reasons for this, of course, is that mules are expensive animals. In fact, mules are often more expensive than horses, if you take roughly similar types of animals, because they're more expensive to breed.
I was very interested in the aspect when you basically argued which kind of cultures were interested in the mule and which were not, and basically arguing from a cultural perspective. And I was just a bit curious about, you mentioned the hadith, and I mean the specific like words and phrases of the Prophet, and this is such a tricky issue. I mean, probably would be possible to find a hadith where Muhammad also says, well, use the mules. I mean, it's rather a question, because using a hadith as a source is so tricky, because like we have thousands of hadiths which are basically not always right and can't be very much easily contradicted. And if we argue that the mule has been a tool for early modern modernity, like regarding a specific movement, couldn't it be misunderstood that specific cultures, from a cultural argumentation, lack this specific tool? And once again, like we were talking about the Muslims, that there is a reason for possible decline because they were not, from a cultural perspective, interested in a mule, but basically they had the camel. I mean, the camel was very useful as well. So it's just a question of, isn't it a bit risky using a hadith as a main source, or say, okay, the whole Muslim sphere wasn't interested in this? But thank you very much, sisters.
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, it's quite important to stress the difference between the use of mules and the breeding of mules. Right? The use of mules is uncontroversial in Islam, because there is a verse of the Holy Quran which actually says horses, mules, and donkeys were given to you for your use and enjoyment. So this is in the Quran. There's no problem. You can use mules. The problem is breeding. Right? Can you breed? And the hadiths are very problematic. They're weak. The transmission is weak. I think there's one in the Dawood collection, which is one of the canonical collections, but many of the others are in non-canonical collections. So my problem is not so much whether the hadiths are weak or strong, but really who in Islam believed them when. That's the really key thing. Because, I mean, you can argue till the cows come home or the mules come home as to, whether these hadiths are real or not. And interestingly, you tend to get a very strong adherence to this in South Asia, where I think what's happening is you're getting a contamination from Hinduism. So, in fact, you get a hadith is cited in South Asian collections, which I've never seen cited anywhere else, against mule breeding. And I think this may be a kind of Hindu influence. I mean, having said that, the Punjabi will breed mules. Punjabi mules are the finest mules in South Asia. But, in fact, there are even some Hindu castes who breed mules in the Punjab. So it's not quite as simple as it sounds. But I think you have to look at the kind of cultural influence coming from other civilizations into Islam. And what strikes me is that, on the whole, these hadiths against mule breeding are most observed in the Arab-speaking world. Right? I can think of no real area in the Arab-speaking world where mules are bred on a large scale. Right? Where you get a lot of mules bred are in the Berber-speaking areas of North Africa, particularly Morocco, Kabylia. So the Berbers have no problems, and you get many, many mules bred in the Persian-speaking areas, and in Kurdistan, for instance, in sort of macro-Persian world, if you like. There seems to be if you like, there seems to be a cultural way of reading Islam, whereby Arabic-speaking peoples tend to take these hadiths seriously, and non-Arabic speaking peoples tend not to, unless they're influenced by something else, like Hinduism. I mean, this is a very kind of... But one thing which I have also discovered writing to Islamic intellectuals is that you must never, ever say that the hadiths against mule breeding are a hangover from Judaism. Right? I have said this to a Egyptian scholar, and my inbox nearly exploded. He was extremely angry. Right? You mustn't talk about it. I mean, I think it probably is, but you mustn't talk about it. Right? So you have all sorts of sensibilities, even today, about this, which are quite striking. In terms of the use of the camel, of course, what's quite interesting is that the Turks and the Persians, but particularly the Turkic-speaking peoples, use a lot of hybrid camels. So they use these dromedary Bactrian hybrids, which again have the same advantages, hybrid vigor. The Arabs, however, actually it really is the Turkic-speaking groups who use these most. And whether there's any objection to using them in the Arab world, something I need to find out. But the opposition to hybrids can be more general than just the horse-donkey hybrid. There can be a more sort of, and again by analogy, because the ulama often work by analogy. And so if by analogy, if you can't do it with a horse and donkey, then you can't do it with a Bactrian and a dromedary.
Yeah, thank you. I have three curiosities, really, many, but I just mentioned three. One is regarding the technology of breeding. You were mentioning the rediscovery of columella in the early 15th century. So before the 20th century, how much there is a circulation of knowledge or a circulation of experts, let's say, even from different civilizations? How is this organized? The second question regards the business side. So it's always, you were showing the ship, the Danish ship with 200 or something mules. Is it always a small trading, or it's, for instance, are there general supplier for the army? So can it be big business? Can you be a big mule trader in a sense and become rich with that? And the third is a very small, and it's just a small curiosity. Do they always have names, like horses? Are they named?
Start with the technology and the use of written materials. Definitely you have, columella is rediscovered, is circulated, and there's quite a lot on mule breeding there. And in China you have a lot of manuals which will tell you how to do it. The problem for historians is always to know how much these were applied and how much they were important. Because there's also an enormous amount of oral knowledge which is circulating, and practical knowledge which simply is done from person to person. And disentangling those is I think, really quite hard. What we really need is for a mule breeder to say, yes, I discovered columella and I read it and it transformed my way of thinking and I started breeding mules completely differently. But, until I find that kind of document, I remain a little bit suspicious. I think what's perhaps more important about these tracts is that they give a kind of elite imprimatur to the breeding of mules. That once you get these things circulating and elite people taking them seriously, then it becomes something that you can do because the elites think it's okay to do it. So it may be that the effect of these tracts is more ideological than practical. Okay? I'm speculating here, but it's something which certainly needs to be looked at. In terms of the business of selling mules, this does become very, very big business indeed, certainly for the overland trade. So if you look at the overland trade from what's today Argentina to Peru and Bolivia, you are getting a concentrate, by the end of the 18th century, you're getting a real concentration into the hands of half a dozen really big traders in Salta, in northern Argentina, and a tendency for the smaller traders to become more marginalized. And I think this has to do with the enormous risks. You're moving mules over 4,000 kilometers, something like that. This really is a risky business, and the loss of mules, particularly in the high Andes, is relatively high. So you need a lot of capital in a way and a lot of this is on credit, and you're never quite sure that the guys who come from Peru are really going to pay you the 50% that they owe you, and when they won't perhaps come back next season, and so this does become really very big business indeed. Now the other interesting thing about it is it also becomes the organizing matrix, if you like, for rebellion in Spanish America. So Tupac Amaru is a major mule dealer, and you find again and again and again that the big rebellions, and this is true for instance 1810 in Mexico, the big rebellions are often run by muleteers. And I think this is partly to do with the fact that the muleteers have the real regional connections. They move over 4,000 kilometers. They have the knowledge. They have the information. They can spread the word. But also they have status and they have capital, and they're relatively wealthy people. And so, although they may lead peasant rebellions, they themselves are people of considerable economic importance. And it's not just in in Latin America, you find exactly the same thing in China. If you look at the big mule and caravans organized out of Yunnan in southwestern China, mainly by Muslim Chinese, by Huihui, what you find is, again, the same kind of concentration. These are big business organizations. When it comes to the movement by sea, the really big change is the change from sail shipping to steam shipping. By the time you get to steam shipping, you're moving perhaps 1,000 mules, not 200 mules. And then you're getting a level of equipment which is extraordinary. I mean, for instance, there's a firm bringing mules from San Francisco to Fiji and to the Philippines, and every mule has electric light, every mule has an electric fan. I mean, you know, this is high-tech luxury pampering of animals, right? You're moving a long way from the old system. Now, in the 18th century or the late 17th century, if you're looking at the transport of mules to the Caribbean, it's completely different. You're moving mules often simply on deck. They're not moved in the hold at all. You're moving perhaps 30 mules, 40 mules, probably not more, in terrible conditions, and sometimes without sufficient water, without sufficient food. So there's a real tendency, I think, over time for capital concentration and for bigger businesses to emerge. But these do become very big businesses. Even in the modern times, when the Americans were supplying mules to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, it's interesting that the American army contracts with just one Tennessee firm to supply several thousand mules to the Mujahideen, who actually take one look at these gigantic American mules and say, you must be mad. We can't use these huge mules in Afghanistan. So they sell them all off to Pakistan and buy horses or small Pakistani mules instead. Names. Certainly in a kind of context of, say, like mountain gunners, every mule would have a name. Whether this is true in plantations, I don't know. So I think it tends to be where there is more reliance on the animal for survival, then you're much more likely to name the mule and to have a much more personal. And one of the things which is very striking, if you look at the reminiscences, say, of British mountain gunners in the northwest frontier in India, I mean, they loved their mules more than anything else, more than their fellow soldiers, certainly more than the Indians. The bond between the mountain gunner and his mule was just fantastic.
Yeah, just a comment on the relationship between prejudice and efficiency. I was on the receiving side when the Americans sent the Tennessee Mules to Afghanistan. And it's true that, from an efficiency point of view, they were far more efficient. To go to the northeast to carry ammunitions during the war, there were 5 to 6 passes and all above 4,000 and some hundred meters. And the Afghans use horses, so the rate of casualties was very high. And a horse can take only 50 kilo, at most 80 kilos, at this kind of altitudes. So the mules could carry 100 kilos. But they sold the mules. Yeah, the Afghans sold the Tennessee mules, a good price, by the way, because other people did consider that they were very good mules. A bit stubborn, but, from Tennessee. So there is an element here which is, it was not religious. They never used the hadith argument. It was an issue of status. A mujahideen cannot go with a mule. It's not noble. No. So they have to be with a horse. And when they use bad terms for the mules, it was never religious, it was always bastards, like this kind of term. So it was, they just despise mules.
I remember that the Islamic prohibition is not on the use of mules, so you would not expect hadith to be used for that. So in terms of using mules, it's much more cultural, and the idea of bastardy, the idea of the noble horse and the base donkey. So it seems to me that wherever you get a kind of Hindu cultural influence, you're more likely to get this very strong prejudice against using or having or being in any way associated with mules. Now, whether that stretches as far as Afghanistan is an interesting question, but it's also a question of the Turkic areas. Turkic areas have a very strong dislike of donkeys and mules, and Mongol Turkic populations kind of look down on them. And Jamil Hanifi, who's an Afghan anthropologist, has suggested to me that in the Pakhtun areas of Afghanistan, it's the Tajik clients, it's the subordinate Tajik populations, Persian populations, or Persian-speaking populations, who actually breed and look after the mules. And a Pakhtun, it's above him to do this, but it's okay for his client to do it, which is so that you get these kind of complicated ethnic, and generally speaking, it seems to me that everywhere it's the Persianate, it's the Persian cultural influence which is most pro-mule. And this is perhaps not entirely surprising because it's the Persians are amongst the oldest breeders and users of mules. They've been doing it for centuries and centuries, and therefore it's perhaps more ingrained in their culture. I mean, one has to be a little bit careful about these things, but they definitely seem to be less affected by this idea of bastardy and by the idea of noble and ignoble animals.
I just had a sort of curiosity. With all the sort of prejudices, both sort of religious and cultural, was there sort of a common alternative to mules, or was it geographically dependent on topography, for instance?
Yes, that's a very interesting and complicated question. I mean, one of the simplest arguments is in favor of the camel, that the camel is much better in sandy conditions. Mules have relatively small hooves, so mud, sand, not terribly good for mules. Having said that, I mean, we've got to be a little bit careful about this because, for instance, the Poitou mule in France is bred with particularly large hooves, and therefore the Poitou mule was actually quite effective in the north of France in relatively muddy conditions. So a mule is a mule is a mule. You have to think about what kind of mule. But generally speaking, certainly in the Middle East, the camels would be preferred for longer distance and for sandy conditions. When you get to the Balkans, however, I'm still a little bit perplexed that the Ottomans used so many camels in the Balkans. And both the sieges of Vienna were largely supplied by camels. I mean, even these dromedary Bactrian hybrids, which are strong animals, and of course the Bactrian does better in colder weather, but even so, you wonder if they wouldn't have been more sensibly advised to use mules. And conversely, there are areas where you'd expect mules to exist, and they don't, or hardly. Like, if you look at the Sudan Sahel band of West Africa, there are both donkeys and horses present. There are mules. There are mules, particularly in the Hausa areas and in the Fouta Djallon in Guinea, but never very many. And I think in this area of West Africa, I think what you're hitting again is the kind of cultural prejudice that the horse is so noble and the donkey is so base that the idea of mating them is kind of repugnant. But I mean, having said that, my Nigerian colleagues, when I ask them about this, they always say, my North Nigerian colleagues always say, oh, it's very difficult to produce a mule. So they always put the accent on the technical difficulty, not, I mean, that may be because they're westernized intellectuals who don't want to engage in this kind of stuff about prejudices about animals. I don't know, but it is a very uniform response that I'm getting from West Africa. So, perhaps one has to take it seriously. Now, what other alternatives are there? Well, obviously oxen. And the big debate in Spain is about ploughing. Do you plough with oxen or do you plough with mules? And in Spain, this is quite vitriolic. I mean, the literature on this is unbelievably propagandistic and harsh. And on the whole, it's all anti-mule. At least I've not really come across anything which is pro-mule. It's saying that you should use oxen. Oxen are slower, but they plough more deeply, which I think is rubbish. I think mules, it depends on kind of mule you're using. You can plough deep with a big mule, and they plough much faster. So it seems to be that the prejudice is much more, I mean, it's kind of trying to explain it in economic terms, but it's actually a cultural thing. And again, what you get in the Spanish literature is that mules are horrible, they're horrendous, they're against nature, they're revolting, they look foul, they look like beasts from hell. And this association with the devil is actually quite commonly made, I think probably coming through the donkey and witchcraft and this sort of thing. So this literature is extremely polemical, and it's really, I think, pushing a very uneconomic kind of position. Now, the other argument in Spain, of course, is that the war horses are dying out. We have no war horses to fight the French because everyone's breeding mules. And even the fine Andalusian mares, et cetera, are being put to the horrible Garagnon, And so this literature is what I think causes the Spanish state to act. And what we get from the time of Philip II is a series of decrees which say that only certain mares can be put to the donkey. We even get this in France. In 1717, the Intendant du Haras says that only mares of under 4 feet at the withers can be put to the baudet. Right. I don't think this is observed at all. I think it's one of these pieces of legislation which is completely ignored. But there is a real, in Spain though it's more important. In Spain there is, I think, a real regional difference as to where you can breed mules and where you can't in an attempt to preserve cavalry horses. So there are lots and lots of different possible alternatives, and one should also see the donkey as an alternative to the mule. One of the things which is quite interesting is that since independence in Latin America, there has been a tendency to replace mules with donkeys, particularly in the high Andes, and I'm not terribly sure why this is, although one of my theories is that it's harder to get a donkey to swim than a mule. And so once you get more bridges, it becomes easier to use donkeys than to use mules, and they may be better on extremely steep slopes. And this brings back, I forgot about the earlier question about why do the Americans, once they're independent, move away from the English prejudices against mules. And I think the answer is partly to be bloody-minded and anti-English. And I think one tends to forget how important it was to the early American revolutionaries to have good relations with their neighbors to the south. Right? This comes across all the time. And so they're going to eat more cacao, or drink more cacao rather, in those days, there's chocolate, and they're going to do everything more like the Latin Americans because there is this sort of sense of American solidarity. So mules are very much part of this discourse. Our brothers, not our sisters, but our brothers to the south have mules, so we're going to have mules as well. And this comes through very strongly in George Washington's own writings. Okay? So there is a real sort of sense that this is the mule is an anti-English animal. And I mean, you can, well, how important is this? I mean, is the bottom line what really counts? Or how much do people sacrifice economic gain to ideological? These are very difficult questions to answer. But I think definitely there is the fact that you're even using mules in New England, which is ecologically not a terribly suitable place for mules. The winters are too cold and so on and so forth. I think testifies to this kind of the strength of anti-colonialism as part of this process.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I have to admit that I didn't take the animal turn, although having been trained by Daniel Roche, I have to admit that at some point our path diverged. Daniel Roche being, for those of you who are not French addicts, the important historian, a previous colleague from this place, who wrote absolutely fundamental contribution on horse history, by the way. So I admit I have some resistance. Nevertheless, your talk was absolutely fascinating, and it made me think about let's say, the more methodological aspects related to your presentation and to global history. So let me try very, very briefly to shape my question. I was wondering to what extent, if your project was about, because now we have it, we have a book, to write a global history of mule, but maybe it was to use mule in order to demonstrate that there is a possible global history to be written. So let's leave it open, but I would be very interested in listening about your comments on this. You know that we are very interested in the department by global history. We advertise the department as one of the few places where global history takes place. So I think it's very interesting for our researchers to have this. So admitted that yours is a global history of mule, I was wondering to what extent it could have been interesting for you to look at the constant opposite to the mule animal, which may be located in different places of the world. Because interestingly, during the discussion, we have constantly been faced with mule and horse, mule and camel, and certainly at some point there is mule and elephant, etc., etc. And I was wondering and each of these animals, of course, being, from a cultural perspective, highly charged, of course. And I was just wondering if in your book, and I'm very, very sorry, I have to apologize, I didn't have time up to now to read it, this kind of interplay between the mule and the non-mule into different cultural areas, so that you could maybe develop a more, how should I say, nuanced history, a history made of conflictive representations, uses also. So for instance, in economic terms. This was a bit the kind of questions as a French tête de mule I had in mind. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm struggling all the time with this tension between economics and ideology in a broad sense. And you're right that a further complication is that the mule is always being compared to other animals. I mean, the elephant is interesting because the elephant in both South and Southeast Asia is a noble animal. And in fact, in terms of reincarnation, I mean, it might even be more noble than a human under certain circumstances, certainly a white elephant, for instance. So the question of, under what conditions can one, and what gives nobility to people and so on and so forth, is very strikingly different in different societies. I mean, to give one example, I mean, the Sultan of Morocco can ride a mule in very, very, important ceremonial occasions, and it's seen as enhancing the Sultan's presence. But if the King of England was to ride a mule, everyone would laugh. I mean, this would be So there is this kind of the whole kind of ideology of what is a suitable mount for different orders in society. And of course, this is very much linked to sumptuary legislation. So that in Islam, it's okay for a dhimmi to ride a mule or a donkey, but for a dhimmi to ride a horse is problematic. And a dhimmi will often have to dismount from a horse when faced with a Muslim. So there is a whole kind of etiquette, a whole kind of gradation, and horses become very highly charged with a whole series of rhetorical sort of devices, because there's a whole lot of analogy. So animals are used to exemplify certain kinds of characteristics, certain kind of qualities, and therefore the rider participates in the qualities of his mount, or perhaps her mount in the case of women too, because what women are allowed to ride and what it does to a woman is of course also quite important. And also what a cleric, a person of religion can ride. I mean, in fact, in Islam, tendency is for the ulama to ride big riding donkeys. Why that should be, why not mules, I find very hard to discover. So, and this is very, very culturally specific, and it does vary hugely from culture to culture. So that when you get a situation like India, where you get an Islamic overlay on a kind of Hindu, Jain, Buddhist substratum, then it becomes really complicated because we've got all these different conflicting traditions affecting each other.
Another question. I mean, looking at your presentation, I was thinking of possible turning points in the use of mules, and you said, or more or less I understood, there is a moment which is the Atlantic expansion of Europe, which seems to me crucial. And that, so I was wondering to what extent, and this is also a very general question, that is a reflection of a sort of Eurocentric vision that we as Europeans have about the history of mules, or it is true that this meant processing which there's a conversion of factors like distance, the boom of a plantation economy in the Americas, the need to transport and to use an animal which is very strong but also very, I mean, is less expensive to maintain than the horse, for example, is stronger than the donkey. So the conditions were precisely linked very much to the Atlantic expansion. And to what extent this is a real crucial point of, it's a problem of our perspective as Europeans, which led the Atlantic world since the 16th century.
That's a kind of quite a complicated question. I mean, even within the Western world, the fact that you get a huge expansion of mules in the Americas has a kind of interestingly double-sided effect. And once mules become very American, they then become rather looked down on. I mean, there's a kind of sense of cultural superiority of Europeans. And this is particularly, I think, striking in the Anglo-Saxon world, where mules are the butt of a whole series of jokes about the Iberians. And so perhaps the English dislike of mules is kind of reinforced by the whole kind of expansion in the Americas. And therefore it takes really George Washington. I mean, George Washington's important in this story. It takes George Washington to say, we want mules like our Spanish and Portuguese cousins in the South. I mean, this is a big moment. I mean, people often say, well, Washington wasn't as important in the development of the American mule industry as people have said, and that's true. He wasn't the originator of it, but he was important in ideological terms. I think the fantastic ideological weight of Washington in saying that, you know, we want to develop mules, I think is actually extremely important. So there is a kind of cultural cringe problem, and it's very interesting to try and work out whether the huge expansion of mules in the Americas actually leads to any kind of reduction in their prestige in Europe. I mean, that would be a very interesting thing to look at. But from the other side of the world, I think it's very important to look at China as the driver of mule culture in Asia more than any other. And in China, it's much, much harder. I mean, I don't know. I've just not been able to get so much information on what happens in China. But there definitely seems to be a change with the rise of the Ming dynasty, right? Partially reversed by the Qing, because the Qing come from a horse using Central Asian tradition where the horse is the noble animal and the donkey is base. But then the ability of the Qing in a way to impose that kind of Manchurian culture on China, I think, was kind of fairly limited. So that the real turning point, possibly anyway, is under the Ming. And the extent to which mules become to be seen as a Chinese animal, I think, is quite striking. In Southeast Asia, for instance, it is very much seen as a Chinese animal. And in fact, if you look at the people who raise mules in Burma or in Thailand, they very often are Chinese. They're Chinese immigrant groups living in the north of these countries who actually are the specialist breeders of mules. There are some exceptions. For instance, the Palaung groups also breed mules. So we do get Southeast Asian groups breeding mules, but it's seen as a kind of Chinese thing, right? And very much linked to China. So there are lots of ways of kind of appreciating this, and the relative importance of the mule to the horse in China is also a very complicated question. But there is a tendency in China, I think, to reserve the horse entirely to military usage. Right? The horse is a military animal in China. The mule is used for almost everything else, right? And is a better animal for almost everything else. Now, that's not the same in Europe. Right? That's different from the European pattern, where horses are seen as better in certain circumstances. The question, of course, of the Chinese prejudice or not against the donkey is an interesting one too, because there is a Chinese prejudice against the donkey, but it's different. It's perhaps not so strong as the European prejudice against the donkey. I mean, that's a difficult thing to work out. So we're constantly struggling with the economic, the military, the social, the ideological. There's a whole series of things which kind of, make it difficult to understand why particular bricolages of animals emerge in different places and how they evolve.
short question. I like the idea of this tension between mechanization and animals. That's David Edgerton's point on horses and the difference between innovation and use. This idea of the Bessemer was not used until quite late. So I would like to know more about this tension between the steam engine and the mule. There is some complementarity, and also during the First World War there is some complementarity between the use of mechanized automobiles and the mule. And the other idea is also David Edgerton's Creole technology has become the mule technology for poor countries. It's just a third world vehicle or something like that. I think it's also in this book, but it's also a separate article, this Creole technologies for poor cities and so on.
The whole question of the way in which mechanization affects animals, I mean, not just the mule, in fact, more generally, is, of course, extremely complicated. But basically what I think mechanization, steam mechanization does, is to push animals into short and medium distance transport. This is really the big change, right? So that you get an increase in the use of animals in cities and an increase in the use of animals from the railhead, from the steamer port, inland as well as on the sea. And it's the internal combustion engine which really changes which really leads to a reduction in the kind of transport use of mules and of animals more generally. And in that sense, the First World War is actually extremely important, because the First World War acts as a kind of forcing house for the use of more internal combustion, and the sort of displacement of animals in war is quite striking during the First World War, and then that really kind of carries over into the interwar years. But as you say, of course, then it becomes a third world technology. It becomes a technology where the internal combustion engine is not spread in the same sort of way. And that is particularly important, I think, after the Second World War, where there's a kind of real ghettoization of not just the mule, but other forms of animal use. It's very much ghettoized in the poor world, so that use of animals becomes a sign of poverty. And this leads, I think, to, in the First World, leads to effectively over-mechanization. Right? So machines are being used where they're not appropriate, where they're actually worse than animals. Forestry is a very good example of this. When you get very poor soils in forestry, and where machines compact the soil, destroy the soil, where it's very difficult to take out individual trees if you're not using animals, if you're using machines. And so that there's been an over-mechanization, an ideological over-mechanization in the West, which is we're only just beginning to get away from. And we're beginning to return to the use of animals in a number of niche kind of applications. And this, of course, is then changing the balance. So for animals, I think from about the 1940s to about the 1970s, were seen as symbols of poverty. Right? If you use an outwork animal, you're poor. Right? And this is changing. I think what's changing now is that there's this the notion of appropriate technology, of animals being better technologies for certain. And of course, they don't use oil. So if we are short of oil, this is very interesting in Cuba. Once Cuba can't get any oil anymore, or can't get any cheap oil anymore, you get a massive return to animal power in Cuba. And it's one of the areas in the Western world, or Western Hemisphere, where animals are actually most used, and where there's the most research going on into mules. Interestingly, too, actually, in Cuba, there's the use of the Spanish language, which is moving away from certain kind of traditional Spanish uses where you would not say mulo very much in Spanish, and you just think words like macho and things, but the Cubans always say mulo. And I think there's a kind of we're not going back to Spanish colonialism, where we're sort of developing our own revolutionary socialist vocabulary. I mean, it's very striking, because you never see mulo anywhere in the early in the early modern period. And so the Cubans are trying to stamp their own use. But of course, the Cuban example would tend to actually reinstate the idea of animals equals poverty. It's the failure of the Cuban economy. It's the failure of socialism. It's the failure of this way of organizing your economy, which leads you to then go back to animals. So animals are a badge of poverty. Whereas it's exactly the opposite, which is happening in places like California, where mules are coming back massively as firefighting animals, for instance. They're much more effective. And they're the cutting edge of technological progress. So we have these different discourses in different parts of the world.
Okay, thank you. you very much. I think we need to close here. Thank you very much, Professor Clarence-Smith. I think that this was an excellent lesson, not only of the history of mules, but also on how historians, to explain some particular phenomenon, need to know many other things. For example, to speak about mules or to research about mules is not only research about mules. You have to know religion, history of religions. You have to know history of technology, history of war, history of empires, etc., which makes global history even more difficult than we thought. Anyway, thank you very much, and I hope we will have you here soon again to illustrate us with this type of new subjects on very old problems in this case. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.